Okay, folks, good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to this evening's Upper House seminar presented by the BSA's own Richard Bradford McConnell student, Dr. Matthew Evans. The dog you hear barking is Chewbacca, who has obviously realized that I'm no longer in the place I was 10 minutes ago. And also the food, I should say, that's not going to be consumed tonight. I'm so sorry, but it makes everybody feel really hungry already. It was Matt's special request, and Sula can't resist a special request. It's a great pleasure to have Matt speaking to us tonight on a topic that has widespread interest, as you can see by the number of people there are in the room. Matt works on the history and archaeology of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the best periods really to work on, in my humble opinion, of Greece, with a special interest in space and social life of gymnasia. And he uses these spaces in particular, as a means of shedding light on local patterns of change. He has a number of forthcoming publications. His monograph, which is called The Senses of Athletics in Ancient Greece, Athletics in Ancient Greece, is forthcoming, as is an article in Hesperia as well. And that's due any day now, is that right?
Maybe.
Okay, anyway, all very exciting. But a lot of this you can find out if you do a kind of polite stalking of Matt online. What colleagues may not know about Matt is that he has an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, matched by an unbelievable level of energy. He puts us all to shame. He just leaves us in dust. He has thrown himself into life at the BSA, helped to energize us. He brings an enthusiasm for the work that everybody is doing back to the BSA, and he has used every opportunity he can to visit sites and museums across Greece and enthuse us all with the stories he has to tell us. Tonight, he is going to talk about group identity, representation, and the Gymnasium on late Hellenistic Delos. Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for the very, very kind introduction. And thank you to the BSA for not only having me, but for also being a very vibrant and welcoming community within which to live and to conduct research. So thank you for that. I should also thank the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Warwick for funding and hosting my doctoral research, and to my supervisors, Professor Zara Newby and Professor Michael Scott, for their comments on my research. During my Viva, I should thank my examiners, Professor Graham Shipley and Dr. Connor Trainer. And finally, I'll thank Freie Universität Berlin and the Berlin Graduate School of Ancient Studies for hosting this part of my research, which was a chapter in my thesis. So let's begin. Let's try and begin. Right, here we go. So in the year 126/5 BCE, on the Cycladic island of Delos, 18 individuals collectively set up this inscribed marble dedication to Apollo, Hermes, and Heracles. The text begins with a formulaic prescript that gives the name of the archon, so the chief magistrate in Athens, as well as the epimeletes, the manager of the island, the gymnasiarch, the official in charge of the gymnasium, and the paidotribes, the trainer. It then tells us about those making the dedication by first specifying their group name, those who were Thebes. In other words, those who completed the 2-year civic education program for 18 to 20-year-old men that was hosted in the Gymnasium. Second, it lists their names one by one in standard Attic naming practice, including their forename, their patronymic, so their father's name, and their demotic or ethnic, in other words, which city or deme they came from. And it does this for all except one individual. The inscription ends by stating the recipients of the dedication to the deities, Apollo, Hermes, and Heracles. What we're pretty much dealing with here is a predecessor of today's school leavers hoodies that most of you will probably know of. The medium might have changed from an inscribed slab of marble to printed fabric, but the idea is the same. So both have some kind of reference to a group of newly graduated students in an institutional context, and a list that's naming those constituent members. And it took me an embarrassing 10 minutes to create this version of the inscription. Commemorative dedications by thieves once they completed their training, such as the one we just saw, were not uncommon in Hellenistic period and the imperial period as well, since countless others can be found on Delos in Athens, as shown by this example on the right, and in other city-states too. So this one on the right is a dedication to Hermes by the former Thebes in Athens. But what's interesting about this example that we've just seen from Delos, and it's unparalleled in that sense, is that the individuals, those 18 individuals, came from a diverse array of places, and thereby included citizens and non-citizens, since Athens was in political control of Delos at this time. 4 of the mentioned individuals come from Attica, 5 from Rome, 3 from modern-day Syria, including 2 from Antioch and 1 from Abydos, 1 from Sidon in Lebanon, 1 from Alexandria in Egypt, 1 from Corcyra, so modern-day Corfu, 1 from Laodicea in Turkey, and 1 from the nearby island of Paros. The remaining individual, if you've been doing the maths, has no demotic or ethnic attributed. What we see here, therefore, is a cosmopolitan group of individuals brought together through the gymnasium-based education on Delos that actively wanted to represent themselves as a coherent group in perpetuity through the setting up of this monument. Gymnasia in the ancient Greek world were spaces and institutions that hosted athletic education and training, among other things, such as bathing, ritual activity, military training, and philosophical discussions. Gymnasia have traditionally been considered in scholarship to have been the reserve of wealthy and elite citizen men, based on textual sources. But how and why was the institution of the Gymnasium on Delos able to bring together citizen and non-citizen individuals, in other words, Athenians and non-Athenians? Why did these individuals wish to represent themselves as members of gymnasium-associated groups? This paper sets out to explore these questions through an analysis of the epigraphy, so inscriptions, related to the gymnasium-associated groups on Delos. In doing so, I want to make 2 main points, both of which have methodological and historical insights. First, I argue that the overarching narratives about the social structure of gymnasia failed to adequately represent the diverse and dynamic social roles that these institutions served within specific communities. Instead, I propose that we should consider each gymnasium in its local context, considering changes over time and socio-political, economic, and cultural conditions. My second argument is that the conventional top-down approach in which gymnasia have historically been viewed, particularly concerning cultural interactions and social roles, offers only a partial perspective. For instance, the gymnasium-based educational institutions on Delos have primarily been evaluated solely in relation to Athens, following Athens' political control over Delos and its institutions after 167. I'll elaborate on that shortly. So this ethnocentric and political or even colonial perspective often yields a negative portrayal, suggesting that the Ephabet, so that 2-year education program based in the gymnasium, on Delos was insignificant compared to its counterpart in the metropolis. I instead want to move towards a bottom-up, localized perspective of gymnasia by focusing on the individuals that frequented them and the ways that they represented themselves or were represented by others. This gives us an insight into the meaning that gymnasia held for individuals and how they helped shape social identities, thereby expanding our understanding of gymnasia and our approach to these institutions and spaces. To offer some context before getting into the details, the island of Delos is located in the center of the Aegean Sea as part of the Cycladic island groups. It's well known for its Panhellenic sanctuary to Apollo, and also for being a center of trade and commerce, especially in the 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE. In 167/6 BCE, Rome handed back the island to Athens after achieving victory in the 3rd Macedonian War. ending the period of independence for the polis of Delos that it had enjoyed since 314 BCE, and beginning what we call the Second Athenian Domination. Upon assuming control, Athens removed the native Delians and sent Athenian colonists to populate the island. Rome also declared Delos a free port, meaning it is free of tax, and consequently the island's population rapidly increased in size and diversity as countless traders and their families moved to the island from all corners of the Mediterranean to take advantages of these economic conditions. This flourishing of the island, however, was somewhat short-lived, since in 88 BCE, the island was ransacked by the forces of the Pontian king Mithridates during the Mithridatic Wars, and again in 69 BCE by pirates. The focus of my paper will be on the Second Athenian Domination, so that 80-odd years of Athenian administration between 167/6 and 88 BCE. Archaeological research on Delos has been led by the French School at Athens since 1873. Over the years, multiple buildings have been identified as excavations as a palaestra or a gymnasium, that's to say, a facility that hosted athletic training and education. The current consensus is that the palaestra of the lake functioned as the island's gymnasium from at least the 3rd century up to the late 2nd century BCE, and this has been proposed by Jean-Charles Moretti. The plan of the building is unclear, no thanks to several later construction phases, as you can see from this quite confusing plan. But in its 3rd century to 2nd century state, it would have included a peristyle courtyard, various rooms off of the colonnades, and potentially running tracks in the open space to the east of the building. In the late 2nd century BCE, a new gymnasium was built to the north, replacing the palaestra of the lake as the place of athletic training and education on Delos. This new complex, termed the Gymnase or the Gymnasium complex, consists of a building with a peristyle courtyard, so GD 76 as you see here, and that has a courtyard in the center, colonnades off of it, and various rooms, and that's connected to another space to the north, which has a xystos, which is a covered running track, GD 77, and the stadium, so GD 78, you see it on there, where running could also be practiced. An ongoing research project led by Dr. Guy Ackermann at the French School, which is reanalyzing the stratigraphy of each complex, will give us further nuance regarding the chronology and identification of these buildings. I'd like to thank Dr. Guy Ackermann for discussing this with me. Just a note on the terminology that I'm going to use today. When I refer to the gymnasium or the gymnasium on Delos, I'll be referring to the institution of the gymnasium rather than the buildings that it housed, in which it was housed, sorry. The gymnasium in this sense was hosted at both the palaestra of the lake and the gymnasium complex, albeit at 2 different times. I'll then use the specific names of each complex or facility when I refer to them in a spatial sense. So this will be fairly rare since this paper focuses predominantly on the users, the individuals who engaged with the institution of the gymnasium and may have physically frequented both facilities. I will thus term those who trained and received education through the institution of the gymnasium users, and I will call those in elected roles at the head of and as part of that institution the gymnasium officials. I hesitate to associate any of these individuals with a particular facility until we have further clarity on their chronology and choose instead to take an institutional approach. So now let's turn our attention to these groups and individuals. To summarize the data that I've collected about the gymnasium on Delos, inscriptions mention 410 individuals that either received education and training within the institution or the facilities, such as the ephebes that we saw earlier, or held offices such as the gymnasiarchy. Whilst this data represents only a small portion of the total gymnasium users and officials, due to the fragmentary nature of the epigraphic record, it's still a decent sample that gives us a good insight into the social dynamics in and around the institution of the gymnasium. As we saw earlier, individuals tend to be named by their forename, their patronymic, and their demotic or ethnic. To focus on the latter identifier, 371 individuals of those 410 are referenced at least with their ethnic or demotic, offering a good insight into the geographical origins of 282 gymnasium users and 89 gymnasium officials. When we chart these origins, and this map shows the spread of individuals that aren't from Attica, otherwise Attica would take up a fair big circle in the middle there. We see that a high number originated from Attica, so 129 in total, whilst many non-Athenians were recorded in the epigraphic record. 153 of the 282 gymnasium users came from 63 different places from as far away as Rome, Egypt, modern-day Iraq, and the Black Sea. Access to gymnasium activities and education, therefore, was open to the diverse families of non-citizens who came to live on the island alongside the Athenian colonists in 167/6 or after 167/6 BCE. Another important detail that's included within the epigraphic references to gymnasium users is a consistent reference to the particular group to which each individual belonged, usually according to their age or role within the institution. Such groups include the Pythes, so the boys of roughly 12 to 17 years old, the Ephebes, the youths of 18 to 20 years old, the Paritactoi, sorry for the Erasmian pronunciation there, so those who had completed the ephebut but continued to train underneath the supervision of gymnasium officials, the Neoi or the Neoniskoi, so young men from 20 to 30 years old, and the Aleiphomenoi, so a term that translates to those who are anointed with oil, which was used to signify the general adult members of the gymnasium, since covering the body with oil was a characteristic practice in Greek athletics. Each of these groups was cosmopolitan in nature, and get ready for me to bombard you with even more numbers. So of the 38 known Pythes, 20 were Athenian and 18 were foreigners from various places, and they're shown in the map here in blue. Hopefully you can see that okay with the lighting. Of the 134 known Ephebes, 43 are from Attica, and 91 are from 43 different foreign places, shown on the map in red. Of the 35 known Paritactoi, 9 are from Attica, while the remaining 26 are foreigners from 21 different polis, shown in orange, which probably isn't very distinguishable from the red here, sorry. We have very little information regarding the Neoi, unfortunately, and I'll come back to that term later. But finally, of the 21 Aleiphomenoi, 12 are from Attica, and 9 are foreigners from 5 different places of origin, shown in green. So if you can't quite see the spread properly, the main point to get from this is that the data shows that many individuals the main point to get from this is whilst the majority of gymnasium users on Delos from a single polis are continually from Athens or Attica, this data shows that many individuals and families who moved to Delos in the 2nd century from various places were able to access and wish to engage with the gymnasium at all ages and stages of life, making each group diverse and cosmopolitan. Straight off the bat, therefore, the gymnasium on Delos exposes the flaws in the generalized narratives. So the gymnasium here was not the reserved citizen men, because if it was, we'd only find Athenians in the epigraphic record. But why did those foreigners wish to be enrolled in the gymnasium? What was in it for them? Taking a bottom-up approach, I'll try to break down this discussion into 3 main factors. So first, civic relevance, 2, socioeconomic exclusivity, and 3, group belonging. One of the most conceivable benefits of enrolling in or attending the gymnasium and its educational institutions on Delos is the link that they provided to civic activities and public life on the island. So gymnasium user groups were relevant bodies within the island civic sphere, as is visible from the honorific monuments that they set up and received. They had the capacity to set up dedications to deities, as we saw earlier, and also to set up honorific statues to not only foreign kings, like the former of Thebes honoring King Nicomedes III of Bithynia in 112 BCE, but also to their officials as practiced by the former of Thebes and Aleiphomenoi. This reflects their capacity to engage in dedicatory and honorific practices, through which those groups could viably form or at least portray themselves as having connections with external royal figures and internal officials. Equally, the honours that gymnasium groups received are indicative of their civic relevance. Again, this involves both foreign kings and gymnasium officials. So Ptolemy IX Soter of Egypt named the Neoi, seemingly referring here to the general use of the gymnasium, alongside the Athenian Demos as the recipients of his benefaction when he supposedly set up the Xystos of the gymnasium complex. A similar architectural benefaction, funded by Gymnasia, was dedicated to the Aleiphomenoi alongside Apollo, whilst we also know that the Aleiphomenoi received other honorific inscriptions. So being part of the gymnasium groups on Delos could therefore offer a chance for individuals to insert themselves into the civic sphere by being members of groups that engaged in honorific and dedicatory practices, and in turn interacted with both Athenian officials and foreign powers. This engagement with civic life went even further, and I'm sorry that my face cuts out the rest of that, but it's activities. So members of the gymnasium groups, regardless of geographical origin, helped to organise and fund athletic and religious events on Delos, and this was made possible through their engagement in the gymnasium. For instance, individuals are attested in inscriptions as performing roles in festivals such as the Hermaia, the Delia or Apollonia, the Theseia, the Athenaia, and the Romaia. Commemorative name lists that were set up by officials of the gymnasium to honour those who performed the roles reflect the importance of the gymnasium in facilitating those roles. From what we can gather, they were seemingly temporary offices that were organizational and financial in nature, and included the offices of gymnasiarchoi and agonothetoi, so the organisers of games, lampedarchoi, so torch race leaders, and hieropoioi, so religious officials. They were open to Athenian and non-Athenian gymnasium users alike, as can be understood from the gymnasium inscriptions. In this way, the temporary offices contrast with the annually elected officials associated with the gymnasium, such as the gymnasiarchy and the paidotribes, since those were only accessible to Athenian citizens. Therefore, these temporary offices offered one of the few chances for people with limited access to civic activities to contribute to this aspect of life on Delos. So overall, the civic relevance of gymnasium-based groups contributes to their significance from the perspective of the families living on Delos. Not only could membership in these groups give individuals and their families a sense of civic recognition, but they also allowed for direct participation in organising the island's civic and religious life. For non-Athenians especially, this was important given their non-citizenship status. In not being able to assume any civic offices on Delos, since these were reserved for Athenian citizens, the gymnasium provided an outlet through which they could contribute to public life and enjoy a sense of civic agency through setting up and receiving honours or dedications and undertaking temporary roles. Another point that made the groups attractive is that they offered a sense of socioeconomic exclusivity to those who were members. To an extent, the formal groups of gymnasium users can be viewed as elite subgroups of society on Delos. So an interesting point that's highlighted in a catalogue of paides, so boys, drawn up by the paidotribes, the trainer Stasias, in the 2nd century BCE on Delos, is that he specifically taught the 3 paides, as it states in the inscription on the right. demonstrating that slaves were not permitted to enroll as paides. Such social exclusivity goes even further, since Stasias appears to be a paidetribes of a private palaestra. He explicitly lists those from his own palaestra in the second line of the inscription. Thus, they would have had to pay a joining fee. Some of the paides were also the sons of high officials, like priests or aristocratic Athenian families, and we know that many continued their training and education in the gymnasium as ephebes. The ephebes, like the paides, belonged to wealthy and well-to-do members of society, as has been illustrated by the prosopographical work of Eric Perrin-Seminadea. These include the sons of the rich, the sons of important magistrates or priests, and descendants of aristocrats. We also know of multiple sets of brothers who participated in gymnasium-based education, both at the level of the paides and that of the ephebes. So wealthy families had a continued interest in enrolling their sons in these seemingly elite institutions. Adding to this socio-economic exclusivity are the temporary offices that I just discussed. So it's perhaps the reserve of the elite youth to engage in such activities, since there was likely a financial burden. In other places, like Varia in northern Greece, only those who could afford to take up the temporary offices were obliged to do so, meaning that the positions and the commemoration acted as public statements of one's economic background, similar to larger scale benefactions or liturgies. Such roles in this light were perhaps significant in defining the socio-economic dynamics of the gymnasium groups by singling out the wealthiest individuals. The gymnasium groups therefore represented elite clubs of sorts, so mostly, if not only, made up of some of the wealthiest individuals on the island. For the wealthy families who moved to Delos, the gymnasium and its associated groups offered a means through which to insert themselves into elite circles of citizens and non-citizens alike. Not only might this have contributed to an elevated sense of importance, as is the nature with socio-economically exclusive groups, but it might have even offered opportunities for social mobility within their new cultural environment by mixing with fellow aristocrats and elites. The combination of civic importance and socio-economic exclusivity within gymnasium groups created a strong sense of belonging and significance for their members, making participation in these groups meaningful and attractive in and of itself. The monuments set up by former ephebes, 7 of which survive and one that we saw earlier, reflect that individuals actively wanted to represent themselves as members of those groups in perpetuity. Whilst marking the completion of an educational program, those monuments are expressions of the sense of shared group identity among those named individuals. To accentuate their group identity, certain physical elements of the inscriptions are used to draw visual attention to the group itself. For instance, indents are used to demarcate the list of named former ephebes from the rest of the text on certain inscriptions, as we see from these 2 examples. So you have the pretext, which are basically dating formulas, and then the indented bit from line 6 down, in each case, is the actual list of names. So it separates the 2 parts of the text. Others use uninscribed spaces for the same purpose and place within a relief crown the name of the gymnasium group as the dedicators and the name of the person they are honouring, thus drawing attention to the group. So in this example here, we have the former ephebes mentioned at the outset of the main text, so Hoya Picasantes. The list of names is then separated from the prescript here by an uninscribed space. And the ephebes are reiterated in a relief crown here in the center, alongside their trainer, the paidetribes, as the person they're honouring, which is itself placed in the center of that list of names. Similar methods of physical or spatial differentiation were used in lists of names drawn up by officials of the groups under their charge. So this stele, set up in 119/118 BCE by the gymnasiarch Ariston, lists the ephebes and the paritactoi under his charge in his year of office, and the elephomenoi, who acted as religious officials of the Apollonia festival. Not only does the text organize the individuals according to groups by the use of their relevant headings or titles, as you can see here, but it also uses columns to physically distinguish them. Returning to the fact that these groups are highly cosmopolitan in nature, their representation when compared to the collective dedications and name lists from other places reflects that gymnasium group identity on Delos transcended any differences of geographical origin or Athenian citizenship status. In inscriptions related to the gymnasium in Athens and Messene, so in the Peloponnese, methods are used to distinguish subgroups based on their demotic, tribal, or ethnic identity. This includes the division of names of citizens into demes or tribes and the separation of foreigners. This is achieved explicitly by using the heading xenoi, meaning foreigners, as can be seen in this ephebic catalogue from Athens here. So in this box, you see the heading of xenoi and the names underneath. In the rest of the inscription, they're placed under their deme titles. Alternatively, it's possibly alluded to through uninscribed space, as is suggested by Stephen Lambert, Christopher Leal, Peter Liddell, and Polly Lowe, for this dedication of ephebic friends from Athens, which includes 2 names of potentially non-citizenship status in the section below the uninscribed space that you see over there. On Delos, however, all epigraphic references to multiple gymnasium user groups are represented as coherent, so without the use of methods to distinguish subgroups based on their ethnic or demotic identifiers. There's no distinction between Athenian and non-Athenians, and thus citizens and non-citizens, in the inscriptions related to the gymnasium on Delos. And the most important element in their representation is their collective belonging to the gymnasium-based groups. Facilitating this is the camaraderie involved in attending the gymnasium, which led to the formation of subgroups and personal bonds amongst its clientele. Evidence of this can be found in the hundreds of graffitied forenames found on the benches and monuments of the Gymnasium of Delos, which are often accompanied by the term phili, or friends. Just like in schools today, where you might find desks plastered with doodles, kind of so-and-so was here, or the obscene image or phrase, those who attended the gymnasium on ancient Delos also wanted to make their mark, or to leave their mark. As with the formal inscriptions, physical aspects of the graffiti were utilized to reinforce their group identity of the philoi, using tabulae ansata, or these tablets with dovetail handles, which you see in this example here. And that's carved into the surfaces of the benches. Not only did this remove earlier graffiti, providing a blank space for the next individuals to inscribe their own, but they also gave prominence to the graffiti inscribed within, reinforcing the group identity amongst those friends by physically framing those individuals. The act of writing up such bonds of friendship in stone physically places those personal bonds into the very fabric and thus memory of the gymnasium, reflecting the importance of such group identities to those individuals. The gymnasium thus offered a space within which one could form meaningful groups on multiple levels, ranging from formal groups like the ephebes or paides to informal groups based on personal bonds of friendship. Adding to their meaning was the fact that these groups transcended differences of origins or citizen status, bringing together citizen and non-citizen, Athenian and foreigner. The inscribed word was an important medium through which those group identities were represented, commemorated, and expressed, with the text and materiality of those monuments and graffiti working to accentuate group identity. To summarize this section, the allure of enrollment in the gymnasium on Delos for Athenians and non-Athenians alike, from the bottom-up perspective, can be understood through the lenses of civic relevance, socioeconomic exclusivity, and group belonging. Firstly, participation in gymnasium-based groups offered a tangible connection to civic life through engagement in honorific practices and participation in public events, providing a pathway for non-citizens to actively contribute to the island's communal activities. Secondly, the exclusivity of these groups, limited to the socio-economic elite, provided a sense of status for affluent families, allowing them to integrate into elite circles. Lastly, the strong sense of camaraderie and group identity fostered within these institutions offered members a sense of belonging and solidarity, transcending differences of origin and citizenship status. Ultimately, membership in these groups offered a meaningful social experience that informed the represented identities of individuals, making the gymnasium a key component of social dynamics on Delos. For the remaining few minutes, I want to take a top-down approach through which gymnasia have traditionally been approached in scholarship. So what did the gymnasium-based groups on Delos offer the Athenian officials like the gymnasiarch? Why did they permit so many non-Athenians and non-citizens to enroll and participate? I acknowledge that in answering and exploring these questions, I'm veering towards the traditional colonial lens that I've been challenging by examining things from the bottom-up perspective. However, I believe that comparing the outcomes of a top-down approach with that of one that's bottom-up, we can provide a richer context for those bottom-up insights and further develop our understanding of the gymnasium on Delos. So first of all, the situation on Delos regarding its gymnasium users was considerably different to that in Athens itself, in that considerably less non-Athenians were enrolled in gymnasium-based groups in the late Hellenistic period. So to take the Ephebes as the best represented group in both places, non-Athenians only made up 14% of the known Ephebes at Athens. Compare this with the staggering 79% on Delos for the Ephebes. Reasons put forward for the inclusion of some foreigners in the Athenian alphabet back in Athens include that it was a means of attracting and retaining wealthy foreigners. And so if we can plausibly apply this also to Delos under Athenian control, permitting access for non-Athenians to join the gymnasium-based groups was a way of keeping on the island the wealthy families that were responsible for Delos's economic boom in the 2nd century. If we think back to the euergetism of gymnasium users through their temporary roles, admitting non-Athenians was a way for the Athenian officials to redirect their financial activities back towards the civic sphere. But just by opening the doors to wealthy foreigners, so to speak, doesn't necessarily mean that they'll enter. So ultimately, the agency sits with those non-citizens in enrolling and attending the gymnasium as active rather than passive agents in this process. Another reason that I can deduce from a top-down perspective for Athenian officials, including non-Athenians in the gymnasium on Delos, was in order to establish and communicate Athenian political power or control over the diverse population of the island. So after 167/6 BCE, the gymnasium on Delos was under the direct control and administration of the Athenians. So the gymnasiarchs and paidotribes, as the officials in charge of the education and training within the gymnasium, were consistently, other than a few exceptions, Athenian citizens. Moreover, the gymnasiarch was appointed by the Athenian clericy or colony on Delos, and this decision had to be ratified by the assembly back in Athens, showing the top-down interest in how the gymnasium was run and organized. In support of this view, the epigraphic evidence shows that the Athenian gymnasiarchs on Delos after 167/6 were aware of the role that their administrative control played in establishing broader narratives of Athenian political power. So a stele found in the vicinity of the gymnasium complex, set up by the gymnasiarch Phocion of Melatea, lists 56 Athenian gymnasiarchs on Delos between the years 167/6 and 112/111. And this includes himself serving in 155/4 BCE. Phocion states in the inscription that he is writing up those who served as gymnasiarchs since the Athenian demos regained the island thanks to Rome, referring to the precise events in 167/6 and the beginning of the Second Athenian Domination. Phocion here is actively and explicitly choosing to omit any Delian or non-Athenian gymnasiarchs who served prior to that point, prior to 167/6, who we know about through their dedications. Instead, Phocion memorializes a curated institutional history of the Gymnasium as it relates to the narrative of the re-establishment of Athenian power, on Delos that is. And the relief Athenian owl, if I can get rid of my face for a minute, sat at the top of the stele, reiterates that this monument is a political message for Athenian power. Myself back up there. A further element in this narrative is the participation of gymnasium groups in the various athletic competitions and religious events, some of which were mentioned above, that were not only reinstated by the Athenian clericy or colony after 167/6 and presided over by Athenian officials, but there were also events like the Athenaia and Romaia that celebrated Athenian and Roman political power respectively. By integrating the gymnasium users into these activities and by allowing those from wealthy backgrounds to take active roles in funding and organizing such events, provided a top-down means of reinforcing Athenian and, in ways, Roman political power over the island's inhabitants. Again, however, these potential narratives of power and control would be irrelevant without the active uptake of non-citizens in the gymnasium on Delos. They were not passive, but played active roles in not only attending the gymnasium, but also in funding, organizing, and participating in events like the Athenaia and Romaia. And so the significance of the gymnasium on Delos and how it was utilized by the Athenian administration is better understood when we consider that Delos in the late Hellenistic period was a place of intense cultural interaction and exchange. This can be seen in a variety of ways, some of which I'll summarize here. For instance, several foreign cults were introduced in both domestic settings and in sanctuaries. These include the cults of Eastern gods like Serapis and Isis of Egypt, Hadad and Atagatis of Syria, and the Beretian Poseidon of Phoenicia, as well as the Italian gods like the Lares Capitales. Many of these spaces reserved for the worship of foreign deities were clustered on and around the terrace of foreign divinities over in the bottom of the map, on the slopes of Mount Cynthus, though there was also a synagogue situated near the gymnasium complex up in the top, just below me. These spaces functioned as meeting places for the worshippers of the cults, who were for the most part, but not exclusively, members of foreign cultural or ethnic groups. A top-down interest can again be seen in the Athenian monopolization of priesthoods and offices, the inventories drawn up by Athenian officials, and Athenians funding the construction of some sanctuaries to foreign cults. Yet some religious meeting places associated with particular foreign cultural or ethnic groups on the island remain somewhat independent of direct Athenian oversight. The best example is the establishment of the Beretian Posidoniasts, located not far from the cloister of the lake, just up there, which was set up in the first half of the 2nd century by the association of the Posidoniasts of Berytos, or Beirut. The establishment was open to Athenians, and certain elements actually worked towards mediating a bottom-up relationship with Athenian power. Yet the activities and cults which took place therein were centered on Phoenician cultural practices. Against the backdrop of Delos's religious and cultural diversity, the gymnasium from the top-down perspective contrasts with other institutions on the island and naturally lends itself to be viewed in a colonial top-down lens. So the gymnasium remained a purely Hellenic institution, so the architecture of the cloister of the lake and the gymnasium complex show little sign of cultural influence, as do the monuments set up therein, as far as we can tell. So they included only depictions of and dedications to traditional gymnasial deities. Ultimately, while families setting on Delos could maintain religious and cultural practices from their places of origin, the specific activities within the gymnasium, particularly involvement in events like the Athenaia and Romaia, ensured that Athenian culture and influence remained paramount in the island's public and religious life. And I know that this portrays the Gymnasium on Delos almost like a vehicle that perpetuates colonial power, but that's precisely the point that I want to make. So if we continue to view gymnasia only from this top-down perspective, we'll continue to overlook what these institutions meant to the individuals that attended and frequented them. When viewed from the bottom up, the Gymnasium on Delos emerges as just one avenue through which individuals express their identities amidst a diversity of options. Its appeal lay in its connections to civic life, the sense of exclusivity it offered, and the meaningful group dynamics that it fostered. So to conclude, this examination of late Hellenistic Delos underscores the importance of analysing the social dynamics of gymnasia on a case-by-case basis. The Gymnasium institution on Delos after 167/6 BCE operated under distinct parameters regarding the inclusion of foreigners, diverging significantly from Athens itself and creating unparalleled social conditions within its institutional framework. Contrary to generalized narratives portraying gymnasia as static, citizen-exclusive entities, they're in fact dynamic, adapting to the specific political, social, economic, and cultural circumstances of local communities. By studying other cases in a similar manner, a more comprehensive understanding of the social roles of gymnasia can be achieved through comparison. Moreover, the case study of Delos sheds light on the limitations of the top-down perspective typically applied to gymnasia. The Gymnasium on Delos served a broader purpose beyond merely a tool for promoting Athenian colonial influence. Similarly, the educational institutions associated with the Gymnasium on Delos were not as insignificant and deteriorated as comparisons with Athens might suggest. For residents of the island, Athenian and non-Athenian alike, these institutions provided a sense of meaning and belonging within their institutional framework, offering civic relevance, socioeconomic exclusivity, and a sense of camaraderie that transcended geographical and cultural origins. The significance of the gymnasium groups in the epigraphic representation of individuals, exemplified by the dedication we saw at the outset of the paper, underscores the profound impact that the gymnasium had on the lives and identities of its attendees. Such inscribed commemorations of membership to groups of various forms cemented their group identities for posterity, and thus played a powerful role in shaping and preserving the collective memory of the island's diverse inhabitants. More broadly, and I promise this is my final point, examining the Gymnasium on Delos from a localized bottom-up perspective sheds light on how mobile individuals and families engaged with institutions such as the gymnasia in the Aegean region. While gymnasia in this area during the Hellenistic period have typically been seen as exclusive and segregating institutions, dividing society based on socioeconomic status and citizenship, the Gymnasium on Delos presents a more nuanced picture. While it does exhibit some elements of socioeconomic exclusivity, it also deviates from the traditional model through the considerable inclusion of non-Athenians and consequently non-citizens in its activities and educational programs. Moreover, these individuals found genuine belonging within the gymnasium community and its constituent groups. Overall, this bottom-up view goes to show how the individuals and families who settled on Delos used institutions like the gymnasium to integrate themselves into the cultural fabric and social dynamics of their new local environment. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Matt. Fantastic, wide-ranging points that are coming out of your data. There are some epigraphy nerds in the audience, and I'm sure everybody want to have a shot at you. But can I ask if you've done any network analysis on the individuals from various different places to see how they might be related to each other?
I haven't got around to that yet, other than creating the maps, so I'm not being able to do the network stuff. So. Yeah, sorry.
But so you don't know if any of them are related to each other other than families that are based on Delos, but you don't know.
Not that I know of, yeah.
Question for. Oh my God, I knew you were going to be a second areas. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. That was very talking. It's wonderful to see you making such excellent use of this kind of British material. The French have been providing us for constantly 100 years now.
Yeah.
It's really really excellent. A few questions then. It's very interesting. You comparing the percentage of foreigners again in Athens in the Delos, and that is very interesting. The question is I know you probably know about this project which is being run by Jeff Wendish and also a colleague at Munich, the Gymnasium. They got a very good database. I think they've got about 450 inscriptions now.
Yeah.
If you compare that, I mean, is the same sort of penetration also going on in the other gymnasia in Asia, or is the evidence just not there?
That's a good question. I know they released a good proportion of their data a few weeks ago, actually, maybe just last week that they released it for Lycia, I think it was. I've not yet had the chance to go into that data because my thesis was focused on mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands. I didn't look at Asia Minor because there's just a huge amount of epigraphic data from there that is being studied in that project. So hopefully down the line, once all their data is released, I can then form a comparison between the two, because I have a data set at the moment for all epigraphy related to gymnasia in mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands, and that's just short of 1,000 inscriptions. So it should be a lot more coming from there eventually, but it should lead to some nice comparisons, especially regarding gymnasium users.
Second question I had is also about the nature of the activities of the ephebs. Because in Athens, again, the ephebia starts out as very military, but then it becomes more cultural as time goes on. Eric, I mean, you're also the book which you were referencing. To what extent, what do we know about the activities of the ephebs, and are they military, are they cultural / athletic?
It's a good question, and unfortunately for Delos in particular, there's not amazing data for the actual activities that they're doing. There's one interesting reference from, I think, the last quarter of the 2nd century BCE. It actually says that the ephebs on Delos are doing training in weapons, which obviously suggests military training of some form. That seems to be not military training in the sense that they're actually preparing for war, but more this almost that they're looking back and continuing these traditions of ephebs in a sense that's honorary rather than actually having a purpose of producing soldiers, because obviously Delos is.
What are they training in? The things they're striking, for instance, the new epigraphic law from
Yes.
They don't seem to be doing any heavy weapons training.
No.
It's archery and javelins and things like that.
Yeah.
The same thing happening on Delos.
We don't have any evidence to say that the same thing is happening on Delos, other than that they're training in weapons.
Okay.
What they do have at the Gymnasium on Delos, so in an inventory created in the 150s BCE, is reference to a load of shields that are used to decorate the walls of the Gymnasium. So again, there's military references there, but whether they're actually doing your hardcore military training or whether that's just something that happens similar in Athens, where it's these practices that they continue for the sake of it. Unfortunately, the data is not there, and I don't want to assume that the exact same thing from Amphipolis is happening down in Delos as well. Thank you.
No, it's great.
Well, there are so many questions. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So my question is, first of all, thank you. My question is similar to Rebecca's, potential personal graphical.
Yes.
And do you think it would be worthwhile to maybe track down the individuals who have thrown you to Delos and see what they're doing back later on their career? That they maybe are priests or hold certain activities in their home city, but more especially if they're acting as foreign judges, or if they are using connections, these kind of diplomatic and sort of skill sets that they.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and something that's Eric Perensemenadea has done that prosopographical research for the Ephebes. I've done similar stuff with the Pides. There's only a few of them in this case, and he actually references some of them as well. But what we do see from that evidence collected by Perensemenadea is that quite a few of the Athenian Ephebes are going on to perform priesthoods. They're making benefactions back in Athens and on Delos. They're undertaking things like can't remember the correct term now, but basically ambassadors. And so they're performing quite important or very important civic roles. There's only one case that I think I found of a non-Athenian again showing up in the epigraphic record, and I think he returns to Crete to undertake an office of some form. I can't remember off the top of my head now, but I've got it in a footnote somewhere. So they are using their training in the gymnasium to then inform their later role. So it is this opportunity to mix with later leaders to kind of learn those key skills that they need for later life. So definitely have a look at Perensemenadea if you're interested in that.
Right, well, second is next. You want something?
Thanks, Mark. That was wonderful. You gave me so much to think about, and I have a ton of questions. I'll only ask one because I get to ask you all. But before I ask the question, very, very briefly, do you happen to remember? You mentioned, just to follow up on the previous question about training. Do you happen to remember the term used for the fighting? Was it Populomachia or? Because that might
I
suggest
think it was
like a training in a hoplite style.
Yeah.
Because we have similar evidence in Asia Minor.
Okay.
But yeah, it's fine.
I'm pretty sure it was something en ophlos. So it's in armor rather than Populomachia. I can't remember off the top of my head now.
Yeah.
I can find it later for you.
No, that's fine.
I've got it somewhere.
With the previous question.
Sure.
But I guess what I can't get my head around is that we've, especially in secondary literature, we've associated the Gymnasium with progression to citizenship.
Yeah.
And how does that work when you have people from all over the Ecumene, the Roman Ecumene, let's say, in one place? Does that graduation apply to their own places? Is it dual citizenship? Do they stay in Delos, which means they're probably then Delians and not Romans or Alexandrians or whatever? Do you have any thoughts about that?
As far as I can tell, no one that we know of from the Ephabet on Delos then went on to get Athenian citizenship. So it wasn't a means of them gaining citizenship in Athens. And as far as I can tell, it's also not a means of them gaining citizenship elsewhere. In the cases where individuals continue to do stuff in and around Delos, they continue to refer to themselves or continue to be referred to as being from their original place of origin. And it's also not sure when these individuals moved to Delos itself, like whether this is second generation individuals who are still referred to by their identifier. I think it's a really good question. And I think that connection between gymnasia and citizenship, especially in this case, yeah, it seems to be blurred a little bit. And I think we should not trust things like Lucian's Anacharsis, which kind of present the gymnasium as this ideal place to create citizens, but rather I think he's doing other things like rhetorical.
So maybe that's it's possible down the
Yeah,
line.
exactly.
Give some indication, because it might be that there are certain officials or merchants settled in the island for more than a year, and they didn't want their kids to miss out on this.
Yeah.
On the FBA, so they just enroll them in the next possible.
Like a boarding school of sorts.
And then we can start looking for them in the islands that they go to when Delos collapse.
Yes.
Collapses. Like,
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Very much so.
Thank you.
sounding like
And thank you very much for your presentation. You were very lively. My question on education relates to your response as well. Can you say that in the gymnasium in Delos, in this kind of educational activity, people move beyond politics because it is a Hellenistic period in which people focus on the betterment of the selves, capture cultivation itself, and they leave it behind politics, although politics is everywhere architecture.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you, do we have any trace of training in the schools of philosophy, like Stoicism, Polytheism, and an observation? I remember Professor, the late Professor Patrimalis, gave a lecture in Cyprus some years ago, and he mentioned something you mentioned concerning Gymnasium in Delos, as a structure communicating Athenian power. Professor Patrimalis said the same
Okay.
for Acropolis.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
So
Well,
observation of
on Delos again, it's a really frustrating case of there's no data to say that the individuals as part of the gymnasium were engaged in philosophical training. Unfortunately, the only activities we know of them doing is that reference to the training in armor, and their engagement in athletic and religious events.
so just athletics.
As far as we can tell from the very fragmentary data, like they could well be participating in philosophical pursuits. And that seems to be what's happening in Athens at this time. There's certainly references elsewhere to philosophers attending gymnasia to teach, but unfortunately on Delos we don't have the data to really look into the exact details of what they're doing, unfortunately. And yeah, for the second point about another kind of viewpoint of Athenian political power being communicated on Delos, I think many things have been viewed through that perspective, I guess. And my idea is to try and look from the other side to see how that was experienced and navigated by the individuals. But no, that's really interesting. I'd like to have a look at that article. Was it an article, did you say? Okay.
After an invitation
Okay.
to the Defense Foundation in Cyprus.
Sure.
Years ago.
Okay.
Some years ago.
Hopefully it got published.
Very interesting.
Okay. Thank you.
So we have another question here, but we've got several questions online. Do you mind hanging on in case the online people feel marginalized?
Okay, so one question, is there any evidence for the type of torch races? This is a period when at Athens, the Athens did a road races.
Sorry, what was that?
So it compares the Athenian evidence when they pick road races that are not here.
Okay.
And asks if we have any evidence in Delos for torch races or any kind of similar road race.
Sure. Regarding rowing races, I've not come across anything for that on Delos so far, but torch races, yes. So we have the Lampidaki, who I mentioned before. We also have in that same inventory that I mentioned earlier, various torches that are set up within, like in the walls of the gymnasium, as commemorations of their victory in those torch races. We have various victors who set up victory monuments before and after 167/6 BC for torch races. So we do have evidence of those, as far as I'm aware, for the gymnasium-based data, but for the rowing, I'm not sure. Sorry, I've not come across anything for Delos.
Someone would like to ask Keith, actually.
Sure.
What is your opinion on the fact that all the 6 architectural dedications to the Gymnasium in GD 76 are made by Athenians? Only the dedication of the Xistos is made by a foreigner, namely the King Ptolemy IX. Do you think that only wealthy Athenians have been asked for financial help for the construction of the new Gymnasium in the late 2nd century, and that foreigners were therefore excluded in this kind of favoritism? And if yes, for that, what reason?
It's a really good question, actually. And I think I'll come back to another point as well at the end, hopefully I've got time, but it's difficult to tell, because I know for other institutes and spaces on Delos, such as the Agora of the Italians, obviously a lot of the funding work for that was processed by, or was provided by wealthy Italian individuals. Whereas for the gymnasium itself, in only having Athenian funders for that building, it's difficult to tell because as far as I know, those Athenians are typically the officials. So the gymnasiarch that I mentioned earlier, who dedicates it to the Elaphomena and Apollo. So were they only Athenians because the officials were the primary benefactors in that sense, who were already only Athenians? And I know there's another private individual, I think, referenced as providing benefactions, who doesn't have an office associated with him. So it's a good question. I don't know why the non-Athenians would be kind of excluded from funding the building of the gymnasium, whilst also being allowed to fund other aspects of athletic life on Delos. Doesn't seem to be a great explanation for that. And that brings me to the point I said I'd make, that within the later gymnasium complex, the one that's created in the late 2nd century BCE, the thought is that the Athenians moved most of the monuments from the Flight of the Lake up to the gymnasium complex. And what's weird about those monuments is that they're not all Athenian in their narrative. They move stuff that came prior to 167 up there. And those monuments reference the demos of Delos. They reference Delian officials like gymnasiarchs. So that blurs the image somewhat of this message of Athenian political power, because they're also providing monuments for Delian status, let's say. One reason I think that might be is to provide this sense of a long-established institution up there, to show that it's not entirely new, but it also has a background, it has a long-established history that they're then curating through the monument of Phocion that I showed earlier. So it's a really good question, and yeah, one to think about more, I think. Thank you, Guy.
Nicholas?
So, thank you very much. Thanks for taking the bottom line approach. I would say if one was first introduced inside history, all those Marxist historians, and bottom line was really aimed at highlighting, let's say, the lower classes. Was that basis in that sort of the others? But here we understand well, and you answered that when you were asked about when we know about this individual's way of life. We are not looking at a lower class. We're looking at upper classes, middle class at worst. And so I've been thinking, because we did use the verb challenge. You said that the approach is challenging the top-down approach. Is there anything suggesting that the way these thieves and participants in the Gymnasium life act challenge really the colonial power of Athens and control of the Athens? Because I would say that it actually replicates and perpetuates the Athenians. The Athenians export this institution, and you have all these upper class individuals who very enthusiastically participate and just replicate, and therefore strengthen the power of Georgia.
Yeah, and I think I'd still argue that there's agency for those non-citizen individuals in engaging in that form of soft power, of that attractive Athenian institute that they've kind of brought to Delos. They're still actively choosing to be a part of that and to perpetuate in some elements of their life. So they also engage in other practices that were less Athenian, like the foreign cults and so on. But in this one aspect, they chose to perpetuate that Athenian model, that Athenian culture that they went down. And you're right in that this isn't completely bottom up from the perspective of the subaltern groups of society on Delos, which I'll speak about in a second. But my reasoning for calling it bottom up was it's relative to but from the actual bottom up, the one bit of data that I didn't have time to mention today, mainly because I'm not fully convinced by the chronology of it or anything yet, because I need to go see it in person. But one house next to the gymnasium complex, I'll go back. the one house set over here, next to the gymnasium complex, against the wall of the stadium. So the stadium was raised up, and the street that runs next to it, where the arrow is pointing, was a fair way below the retaining wall of the stadium. And there's a house next to it, I think it's house 1C, within the stadium quarter, which seems to have been occupied at some point, we can't tell exactly when, by Italian freedmen, who, if you apply the idea that these are socially exclusive, that aren't open to slaves and freedmen, those individuals wouldn't have been accessible, able to access the gymnasium. One thing that's interesting is that when the gymnasium complex is built, when that retaining wall seems to have been added, kind of blocking any access for visual access, that house adds a window in its second floor, which is able, I think, to see into the gymnasium and the stadium. So what we potentially have, if the dates line up, I can't promise that they do, are inhabitants of the house who are freedmen. They can't access the gymnasium socially, but we see their attempt to access those activities visually. They also paint on their walls scenes of the Lares Compitales on the wall facing the stadium, which has scenes of wrestling, athletics, again, linking into the activities that take place within. So as far as I can tell, that's the only data we've got of what this real bottom-up view is of the gymnasia on Delos. But again, I can't promise that that's wholly archaeologically accurate, or if I'm just trying to find that connection there, but potentially it is. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
And then we'll let you.
I wonder if you should consider the use of the term graffiti for the inscription on the bench. Pattern the tablet and satire requires special tools, and the letter forms are graphic rather than manual. Perhaps informal more closely reflects the difference from formal inscriptions.
Yeah, and that's a problem that's found across the board with graffiti, of whether we can class it as graffiti as this informal, kind of ad hoc inscriptions that are created by the hands of the individuals themselves. And the fact that they are able to create these nice tabulae and statae, which presumably would have taken some time, and actually create the inscriptions, suggests that they weren't done in a very short amount of time, that they would have taken longer. So the main reason why they look more like graffiti that are carved by the hands of the individuals themselves is just the untidy nature of all these surfaces. Like, they're crossing over each other all over the place, they're removing them. There seems to be no type of control over how these are set out and who's setting them where, is the only reason that I'd veer towards saying that they're graffiti rather than inscriptions, in the sense that they're commissioned, they're supervised by an official in that sense. But it's a question that I can only really answer by looking at them more in depth. And Prelude, in the 1970 publication of the Gymnasium complex, terms them graffiti, and she studied them to a much greater degree than I did. So I'll follow in her stead for that until I can see them properly. But it's a good methodological question to consider going forward.
I think Matt deserves a glass of wine or 7 at least. And this remains for us to give you a massive thanks for that amazing lecture.
Thank you all.
Q&A session. So thank you so much.